Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Finca Eliza Anaerobic Wash Processed Ecuador from Rising Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Rising, based out of New York City, New York. And one quick note before we start, this coffee is listed as a wash processed coffee, but after doing some background research, I do believe that it is technically an anaerobic wash processed Ecuadorian coffee. So for purposes of this review, we will be identifying it as such. But this is Rising's second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed a Wilton Benitez thermal shock processed Colombian coffee earlier this year. And it won't come as too much of a surprise to anyone that I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of that coffee. And after that review, Jesse of Rising did reach out to us and acknowledge that he probably should have heeded our warning on that one. He was just really eager to showcase that specific coffee. But we did respond saying that he should reach out to us when there is something that he wanted to showcase once again, as we definitely wanted to give them a second opportunity. And that's where this coffee comes into play, as not only does it sound much more like our type of coffee, but it is also a coffee that we're yet to review on this channel, and the first of 3 Ecuadorian Cup of Excellence coffees that we will be featuring from Rising Coffee. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how all 3 of them turned out, as this right here is day 30. And recipe we went with for this coffee was actually through the UFO brewer at a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 95 degrees Celsius, about 203 degrees Fahrenheit. And as mentioned, we did opt for the UFO brewer, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Honestly, when it comes to the UFO brewer, I found that I usually stick to the same grind setting that we have for the V60, which is still in that more medium fine range. Now, roast profile of this coffee, this gave us a better representation of what Rising does offer when it comes to their profile, given that it's a little bit more tricky to tell when it comes to something like a Wilton Benitez thermal shock processed coffee. And given the other coffee roasters that we're working on simultaneously with this coffee, I feel like the best comparison is something like Heart, as this isn't necessarily the lightest coffee out there, but at the same time, it does still skew on the lighter side of things relative to the majority of American-based coffee roasters. And we've also recently reviewed stuff from Say as well as Sweet Bloom, and we found this one to be a little bit lighter than one of the Say coffees that we worked on, as well as the Sweet Bloom coffee that we reviewed as well. Hopefully that gives you a good idea. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression. We did start it, I would say, just a little bit early. They usually suggest, I believe it was either a 3 to 5 week rest period or a 2 to 5 week rest period, but we were told it was probably going to be good at this 2-week window, so we went ahead and opted for the V60. And the first thought is that the coffee wasn't quite as clean as expected for a washed Ecuadorian gesha, likely indicating that there was some additional processing to it. So let me say this, when I picked up all 3 of these coffees, I did take a look originally at the bags and just kind of gandered at the processing methods that were listed on them. Obviously, when we purchased the coffee, I also took a look, and they were also listed on the website as being wash processed coffees. So I assumed that maybe it was some additional fermentation, some additional stage to the coffee. But again, after doing a little bit of background research, the 10th place Finca Eliza Cup of Excellence winner was an anaerobic wash processed coffee. So if this one is in fact the 10th place Ecuadorian Cup of Excellence coffee, it should technically be an anaerobic wash processed coffee, which explains why I was getting the more processed feel to it on that first impression. And that was definitely presented within the listed raspberry senses. Saying that originally on the coffee, I did believe that it was probably going to skew a little bit in that direction, and that definitely was the case the first time we tried this coffee. Outside of that, though, there was a pretty prominent honeysuckle-like experience, especially off brew. So this, for the most part, was a pretty good first impression, if maybe not as clean as expected, a little bit more intense than expected, but still enjoyed the first try. Day 17 through the Chemex, and the coffee was better today, as it did feel like it was a little bit cleaner with less of the fermenty red qualities to it and a bit more of a candied sweetness, which is going to be a bit of a theme when it comes to the coffees that we're discussing from Rising. Outside of that, honeysuckle does continue to remain one of the more prominent qualities of this coffee, as it still does have above average intensity for a washed gesha. I do believe it was around this time frame I took a little bit further of a dive into the processing of this coffee to find it, but the first 2 impressions that I did have was it was supposed to be a wash processed coffee given the labeling on the bag and the website itself, but again, it just seems like maybe there was a little bit more to it. Day 20 through the UFO brewer, and the coffee was the best that had been to this point, offering better cleanliness as there's less of the red fruit qualities again. This honestly was one of the main reasons why we did opt for the UFO brewer in our final brew of this coffee, given that we had great success on this day, especially in terms of the sweetness, as I would say it was a bit more reminiscent of panela. Outside of that, there was a creamy texture and a tropical citric quality, giving it a brighter, cleaner experience altogether. So definitely found this to be one of the more enjoyable days we had up to this point and throughout the entirety of this coffee. Day 23 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, so 15 to 1 at 93 degrees Celsius. And this is the direction we took all of these coffees. That's a little bit of a spoiler for the other rising Ecuadorian coffees we're reviewing. But there are mixed results though, as it does feel like there's a fair bit of fermentiness and heaviness once again, and it also does linger quite a bit in the experience this time around as well. There's a little bit more of a fresh fruit quality and a cleaner tropical sense to go with plenty of the more sugary characteristics to it, so there were definitely some positives to this adjustment. However, I would say that having a little bit more of that heaviness, fermentiness definitely did not seem to help. Day 25 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and this was probably my least favorite day of this coffee up to this point, as it did offer less cleanliness. This time I would say that the red fruit qualities characteristics, especially in a more lychee-like sense, were pronounced and prominent, much more so than it had been up to this point, and it became a more dominant characteristic of this coffee. So there were some concerns that maybe this coffee was already starting to skew in a direction that I wasn't necessarily enjoying. Outside of that, there was a pretty strong nectar-like intensity as well as tropicality, leading to an okay day overall. And day 27, final notes we opted for the UFO brewer with that recipe 16.671 at 95 Celsius. And the coffee was back to one of its better days, so I did have really nice success with this coffee with that specific brewer, largely because it does continue to perform a bit cleaner this way. Coffee does start off well balanced with a mostly creamy tropical nectar sense before cooling down into a much more dynamic experience with qualities ranging from a strong tropical brightness, which is a bit amplified, as well as a prominent red fruit characteristic and citric lemon zest as well. Honeyed florality as well as more of that strong vanilla sugariness are also presented throughout with traces of some white peach. So there's plenty of depth to this coffee, and that's going to be something pretty consistent with all these coffees that we are reviewing from Rising as well, which in theory is to be expected given that not only are they geshas, but they should be some of the best geshas from Ecuador the year that they were in the competition. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s. Let's go through those. We will start with the cleanliness level 4. As mentioned, this coffee did not start out as the cleanest, and I wouldn't necessarily say that at any point this coffee was an overly clean Ecuadorian gesha, as it never really had potential to reach the level 5 mark, but based off the first impression, I didn't think that it ever was going to, and that's kind of the case with the other Ecuadorian coffees too, because I can tell that they're not traditional or truly washed through and through just based off of the intensity of these coffees, and that was definitely the case with this one, as it could be at times the most intense of the 3 Ecuadorian geshas that we're reviewing. So cleanliness level 4. It still had really nice definition. I mean, we were able to pull these notes from this coffee pretty easily. There's an abundance of them in a pretty well-defined sense. Finish, level 4. There were certain days where I mentioned that the finish was just a little bit higher. There are going to be certain things within this tasting wheel that were somewhere between a 3 and a 4 or a 4 and a 5. This is one of them, as the finish did just have a longer lasting sense to it, a combination of that slight tropical red berry as well as the tropicality altogether. So level 4 is where we opted to put that, a little bit of a lingering brightness to it as well. Sweetness, level 4. Very sweet coffee. I mentioned a lot of the sugary characteristics to it, a bit of the candied characteristics, but in addition to that, it's a pretty fruit sweet coffee, which is very nice. I think that the processing probably helped the overall sweetness of this coffee, though truth be told, none of the coffees that we did have from Rising were lacking in terms of sweetness. Plenty of intensity on this one. Florality, level 4, and we mentioned the honeysuckle characteristics to it, a lot of the honeyed qualities, which is going to also be a theme when it comes to these Ecuadorian coffees. I think you'll see just a lot of similarities between the 3 coffees, and that's largely because, of course, they are Ecuadorian geshas, with one having a little bit more processing to it, also roasted by the same roaster, so it would make a lot of sense, but the florality definitely one of the more prominent characteristics, as fully expected for an Ecuadorian gesha. Berry fruit, level 4. Perhaps slightly high, given that the red fruit qualities weren't as pronounced as maybe some of the early days would indicate. We mentioned that there's also that day where the lychee was a bit more dominant and pronounced than we were necessarily expecting. While the raspberry is one of the notes that is listed on here, I wouldn't necessarily say that it was as abundant as even the florality. It was probably second highest fruit characteristic after the citrus, but even then there was enough of it that I said, all right, we'll keep it there at the level 4, given that it had a little bit more of those berry characteristics than the other Ecuadorian coffees. Citrus fruit, level 4, and I can definitely say that this coffee had a lot of the citric zest characteristics. I do believe that lemon was one of the ones we mentioned throughout this review. But yeah, outside of that, it's pretty tropical, so it would make a lot of sense. Can get a little bit of the pineapple-like qualities to it as well. Stone fruit, level 4, also pretty high. I would say that it's pretty close to the berry qualities, but given the just overall intensity of this coffee, I didn't feel that there was too much of an issue putting all 3 of the fruit qualities there at the level 4 mark, because it just does demonstrate how much intensity there was to this coffee. So we get the stone fruit there pretty high as well. Caramel, level 3, we'll go ahead and move on to level 3s. And I mentioned that there's a bit of a, I can't remember if it was in this one. Panela was the one that I largely listed in this one. I don't want to get my Ecuadorian coffees confused. Yeah, there was a different kind of candied characteristic to one of the other coffees that we are working on, but a lot of sugary characteristics on this one. That's why we kept the caramel pretty high at that level 3 mark. Acidity, level 3. I mentioned that it did have a slightly amplified brightness to it. So level 3 and level 4 is where we probably would have put that. It's somewhere in between, but it just didn't reach that level 4 mark enough for us. And then final thing we're discussing, it is the body at a level 3. I do believe that this one had the most body out of the 3 Ecuadorian coffees that we had from Rising, and it would make a lot of sense given the additional processing. I mentioned that it just has a little bit more of a creamy texture than the other coffees. And I think one other thing I want to touch on real quick is the smokiness at the level 1. I can see that maybe if you push these coffees, I definitely don't think that they're meant to be pushed. You might be able to get a very slight touch of roast, but I can say with the exception of some of the slightly higher extraction days that we had early on, we were able to get kind of close to that. I didn't have enough of it to justify putting that there to level 2. So I just wanted to highlight that. Maybe I'll discuss that a little bit more in the other ones, but I think that's probably sufficient for all 3. So yeah, as I'm looking at this tasting well though, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my raw thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Throughout these 3 Rising reviews, I'm going to discuss a lot of these coffees interchangeably, largely because they were pretty similar. They all had some really nice highlights, but I think one of the more interesting facts about the 3 of them is that I felt like I got a pretty good representation and idea of what they were all supposed to be, all with different brew methods, because while this one was my favorite with the UFO brewer, the other 2, one I enjoyed more with the Chemex, one I enjoyed more with the V60, but I felt like I got them all down to what they were intended to be, as I felt like the characteristics in this one were pretty prominent, pretty pronounced, pretty well defined, and as a result I got a pretty good idea and picture of what this coffee was supposed to be. And it's essentially a pretty tropical forward experience with a bit of florality and just a bit more intensity in comparison to some of the other coffees that were also featured in that lineup of Ecuadorian coffees. So kind of wrapping that all up, I would say that I enjoyed this one. I enjoyed the depth of this one. It probably was my second favorite of the 3 coffees, but I think once I go through the other 2 reviews, I'll kind of narrow down as to which one I enjoyed the most. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I do believe that somebody that enjoys a little bit more intensity to their gesha coffees, that's the first place I do want to start, because right off the bat, you're going to be able to tell that it's not a truly delicate, subtle, tame gesha-like experience. It just offers a little bit more of that stronger, creamier, tropical, nectar-like experience throughout the entirety of it. But I do believe that that can be well rewarding, as not only were we able to get an abundance of those characteristics, but they were all presented in a more clean, well-defined, and sugary sense. So definitely a lot of positives to this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Finca Eliza Anaerobic Wash Processed Ecuador from Rising Coffee. Thank you for watching.